Hey guys, it's been a long time since I put in this caveat in one of my videos. I used to say all the time at the start of my videos, if I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. That was back when I was recording a lot of videos in between my Chinese classes or my Japanese classes, University of Victoria. But I often do make more videos when I'm sick or tired. I can't use my mind for other things that might be a bit more strenuous for me. And right now is no exception. I look great and I feel great, but it's an illusion. I've actually been homesick. I'm on antibiotics right now. And because I was on antibiotics, I actually lifted weights for several hours today. Lifting weights, not too mentally strenuous an activity. I'm back to bench pressing about 200 pounds at the moment. It's in kilograms. So 90 kilograms is almost 200 pounds. 198 pounds, something like that. But can't see it in this shirt, but hey. We lifted a lot of weights, went to the office, put in a few hours at work, had a good day on the whole. But actually, I am sick and exhausted. So that's why my mind turned to making this video. So just say, it's been a long time since I said that, but it's true. In most of my videos, I look a lot more tired and run down than I am. If you catch me at my best on a good day. All right. Thought crossed my mind to make a short video reflecting on how I first got interested in Cambodia. What was the first time I ever even really heard the word Cambodia? And for me, it is a very distinctive memory that is linked to my father, who is recently deceased. So for some of you, this might be an interesting story to hear, and for me, it might be an interesting story to tell. I read a comic book, a mainstream DC Comics comic book, a superhero comic book. And I didn't get the whole plot. I only read one issue of this particular comic, so I didn't see what happened next in the storyline. But in this comic, one of the characters, apparently a villain, but I don't know what unfolded, a shadowy figure who could have been a villain later, or maybe he was a hero in disguise, we don't know. But a shadowy figure said something along the lines of, "This has nothing to do with justice. This is about Cambodia, and it's about revenge." And from the context of that moment in the dramatic storyline of this mainstream comic book, I could simply see that the word Cambodia was synonymous with some kind of disaster. And it was a disaster that somehow the United States military was responsible for. So I was a child. I do not know. If I had to guess, maybe I was 8 years old or 9 years old. I could be a little bit off. I do have very, very distinctive memories of my childhood, but normally I remember how tall I was. And now I look back at the memory and I guess, I guess from the angle I was seeing the world at, how old I was. I don't tend to remember things in terms of numbers, but I do have very, very sharp memories of my childhood, which is in some ways a blessing and in some ways a curse, because some of the terrible memories from my childhood really haunted me for years. But I went to my father and I asked him, I didn't ask him, what is Cambodia? Which the child might have asked. I went to my father and I asked him, what was it that the American army did in Cambodia? Was it something similar to Vietnam or Nicaragua? So I was growing up in a left-wing household in Toronto, Canada. I'm not left-wing anymore. I grew out of it. But yeah, my parents very much inculcated left-wing attitudes into me as a kid, and I had to unravel them, figure out what was truth and what was fiction in all the things my parents taught me. But coming up as I did in that social context, I completely expected that my father was going to tell me that Cambodia was another example in the history of the world on that same pattern, where my parents would blame all of the evils on the American side and give me a very one-sided version of the history. I didn't grow up with a rounded, well-balanced memory of the Vietnam War. I was taught that these things were great evils, and I was taught that the Soviet Union was entirely on the side of good and human progress in these conflicts. I grew out of it. That kind of argument is a lot more convincing when you're maybe 6 years old. At 6 years old, it's hard to unravel Cold War propaganda, but let me tell you, even by like age 11, I was harder to convince. But I was really surprised, and I couldn't show my surprise openly. I just looked at my father with disbelief and scrutiny and skepticism, as my father told me with complete conviction that no, Cambodia was an example of the exact opposite. My father taught me that in Vietnam, the Americans had been great villains, but in Cambodia, they had been great heroes. Those are the words he used at the time. My father taught me that in Cambodia, the Americans were defending the legitimate government of Cambodia against the imperialist aggression of the Vietnamese. And that therefore, in Vietnam, the Americans were the villains because the Americans were imperialists trying to control Vietnam. But in Cambodia, the Americans were defending the Cambodians against someone else's imperialism, and therefore they were great heroes. And I sat there looking at him, and at that moment, the only thing I knew about Cambodia, the first thing I ever heard in my life about Cambodia, was this moment in the storyline of a comic book, which was itself mysterious and unresolved. I never read the next issue of that comic book. I never find out where the story went, or who the shadowy figure was, or what was this traumatic memory of Cambodia that was intersecting with the superhero's plotline. I knew that my father wasn't just lying to me. I knew that my father was repeating a lie that he wanted to believe, but couldn't quite believe himself. Even though he did so, from his perspective, with complete conviction. In many ways, the family religion was built on lies of exactly this kind. Many, many, many years later, as an adult, when I was researching the political history of Cambodia, what I would learn was that what my father had just taught me was believed by absolutely nobody except for the official party line of the government of China and those who had to repeat it. What my father was teaching me was not the official propaganda coming from the United States, was not the official propaganda coming from the Soviet Union. That was specifically the Maoist line, and the line continued for many years after the death of Mao Zedong in China, in justifying both the United States intervention in Cambodia and Chinese intervention in Cambodia. As a result of what's called the strategic triangle in geopolitics, one of the strangest arrangements in the history of international diplomacy emerged, where the United States and all of the U.S. allies simultaneously and jointly, in cooperation with China and all of China's allies, were supporting the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, the most notorious, most violent communists in the history of communism. To simplify, perhaps the most violent, one of the most violent, and certainly the most notorious. And both sides struggled to come up with propaganda that could make sense of this to an incredulous public. A public who, up to the early 1970s, had assumed that the United States and China were enemies, as one side was communist, the other side was anti-communist. But to make a long story short, in geopolitics, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not all the time, but often enough. And a man named Richard Nixon sat down with a man named Mao Zedong, and they fashioned out an agreement because at that time, China and the Soviet Union were on the verge of war, and the United States basically had their pick. They could have backed the Soviet side against China, or they could have backed the Chinese side against Russia. And there were several genuine hotspots. It was not a Cold War, that really was a hot war, including the fact that, for example, both the Soviet Union and China wanted to control Mongolia. It's not the only example. Another example, keep it short, of course, both the Soviet Union and China wanted to control Cambodia. Or from China's perspective, they wanted to preserve the independence of Cambodia. They wanted to prevent Cambodia from becoming a Vietnamese colony or becoming a Soviet pawn. So that was the first time I ever heard of Cambodia. And to be honest with you, it's not something that fascinated me. It's not something that then took over my imagination as a boy or as a young man. Many years later, I had the really bizarre experience of remembering something from my own future. That's something that's only happened to me twice in my life. And I do not believe in the supernatural in any way. I don't even believe in the natural. I'm a nihilist. I neither believe in the supernatural nor the natural. But twice in my life, I've had the very strange experience of seeming to remember something that happened in the future, as if I had a memory out of place, not a prognostication, not a prediction, not a daydream. I remember while I was in university, I had a memory of myself in the future living in Laos. and that Laos was going to be a really important part of my life. And at that time, I had no interest in Laos, and I thought that was ridiculous. I was thinking, no, come on. There were other places in Asia I could imagine living. But why Laos? Of anywhere to live, why Laos? Laos was of no interest to me. At that time, I'd never taken books in the Lao language, history, or politics out of the library. Why would I possibly end up living and working in Laos? And again, that didn't fascinate me. But many years later, after that memory, of course, this is many, many years after I was a child and read that comic book, I was living in Bangkok, Thailand with my Canadian girlfriend, my blonde Canadian girlfriend, who was not well suited to the hardships of life in Southeast Asia. And at that time, what I said to her was, well, look, I'm looking at either getting involved in humanitarian work and research in Myanmar, in the border of Myanmar, where then there were refugee camps and civil war, or Cambodia, where the civil war had already wrapped up at that time, but still very much a country in transition. And my girlfriend said to me, basically, she didn't think she could hack it. She didn't think she could survive in Myanmar or in refugee camps in the border of Myanmar, and she didn't think she could survive in Cambodia so well either. And I said, Laos. If there's one third world, war-torn country devastated by bombing, or maybe you can hack it. And I started making the first of several trips from Bangkok to Laos and back again. And I always remember how thrilled I was when I went to the banks of the Mekong River. And I didn't remember the time. Honestly, I had not thought about it again until that moment, that conversation with my girlfriend. I'd never followed up on it in the years in between. There was just no reason for me to take an interest in Laos. But at that time, I thought, oh yeah, right, Laos. And, Laos had a few more decades of peace, of post-war recovery, still very much a war-torn country. I mean, I'll always remember a really, really short anecdote. Once I was up in a small village in the northeast, and I stepped off a dirt path to pick a flower from an incredibly beautiful tree in the tropics, flowering. If you haven't grown up in the tropics, once in a while you see a tree like that just covered in brightly colored blossoms, and it's awesome. Of course, local people, if they've grown up seeing it, they're used to it. But I walked off the path, and the young woman standing next to me looked at me with shock and horror. She didn't say anything, but just the expression on her face, I could really see she was horrified. And I apologized. I was reaching up to pick a flower from the tree. I turned to her and asked, I'm sorry, is this tree of some special religious significance? I'm sorry, like in Buddhism, is this particular tree off limits to take a flower or something? I just had no idea why she was talking. And she said to me, no, you could have been killed. In that area of Laos where I'd stepped off the path, there were so many bombs, so much unexploded ordnance just in the earth, that from her perspective, stepping off that path in that area, just walking a few steps off the well-trodden path, you could be blown up on the spot. So it was a war-torn country, and there were some risks beyond malaria. Once in a while, you got that kind of chilling reminder of the long shadow of the war, but they did already have decades of stability and recovery. And at that time, I only chose to go to Laos because the girlfriend I had couldn't hack it in Cambodia, or couldn't hack it in Myanmar on the more rugged frontiers. And the whole first year I was in Laos, I was still really doubting it. And I broke up with that girlfriend eventually, but I'd say to the other people in my life, including the girlfriend at first, and then she went back to Canada. But I said to people in my life, I just don't know if I should really be here, or if I should be in Cambodia or Myanmar. There's got to be another way ahead. Laos seems sort of like a small backwater, whereas Cambodia seemed huge in my imagination. Just bigger war crimes, bigger genocide, a more ancient, continuous written tradition of the language. Even in the modern literature, in Cambodia, there was more poetry and more political publications. In terms of the free press, what you find in a bookstore, there's a lot more going on. And in Cambodia, of course, both countries were struggling to have some semblance of democracy. But the reality for free speech, very, very different in Laos as opposed to Cambodia. It seemed like Cambodia was always the bigger, deeper, more challenging frontier, and that Laos was something I was just settling for the sake of that girlfriend's creature comforts. For the whole first year, it felt like that. But I stayed in Laos for 2.5 years, and I had a breaking point with that too, where one day I was taken in and interrogated by the police, corrupt police, who were just trying to extort money out of me. And, speaking English and speaking a little bit of Lao, of Laotian, the Lao language, I had to negotiate my way out of this difficult situation. And I did. I completely see. And the police themselves were delighted. I remember they were smiling and laughing. They couldn't believe I did it. But I sort of legally negotiated the situation, said, okay, so if I can provide this document and this document, then you have to let me go without my paying a fine, right? And I managed to get those documents. So, it was a really, really kind of funny process. But of course, I was speaking little isolated words of Lao and very difficult. And when I came back from that, again, the police were nice guys about it. I said to my roommate, I guess at the time, this guy I knew there, he lived upstairs in the same building, not really my roommate, but this guy who lived upstairs, I said to him, wow, those cops, they were the nicest guys who ever tried to extort me, whoever tried to threaten me and steal my money. What a nice bunch of guys, because they were nice about it. And I did win in the end. I didn't pay a dime. But I remember when that happened, I said to myself, okay, it was about a year into it. I got to stop dreaming about Cambodia. Either I'm going to commit 100% to learning Lao. I was still learning Pali, so I was learning 2 languages simultaneously. Or I pack up and leave today, and I go to Cambodia, and I work on that language, and I deal with the corrupt cops there. So that was when I made the change, and I really poured on learning modern Lao, because I said, look, that's a standard I have to meet. I have to speak Lao well enough that I can talk my way out of being held at gunpoint, being held at knife point, being in a situation with soldiers or cops. I've got to be able to go to the frontier and do this. And I decided to do it there, not Myanmar, not Cambodia, etc. And then for about a year and a half, I was in that mode, still studying Pali, still studying Buddhism, still studying ancient history and modern, etc., etc. And so ironically, I only ended up going back to Cambodia and fulfilling that side of my mandate or dream or whatever you want to say after the authorities in Laos threatened to kill me, threatened to send me to a gulag, torture me, kick me out of the country. That whole story. So Cambodia ended up being like my second choice. But it's true. It all started with that comic book and that frankly surreal reminder of the long shadow of the Cold War, of communist misinformation, shall we say, the personal, emotional reality of international geopolitics, even within my own family, even within my father's own life. And in unraveling the political history of the United States, the war in Vietnam, the war in Laos, the war in Cambodia, it's true, I always was also unraveling, in some ways, the mythology that I was raised with, the ideology my father believed in, and finding my way from belief to disbelief, from ideology to nihilism.